What secrets lay hidden behind the painted white faces and elaborate silk kimonos of Edo period Japan? How did young girls transform into masters of dozens of traditional arts? What was the true cost of perfection in a world where every gesture mattered? And why did becoming a geisha require sleeping with wooden blocks supporting your neck night after night? Welcome back to another journey through history's quieter moments, where we explore the fascinating details that textbooks often overlook. I'm your host, and tonight we're stepping into the carefully choreographed world of the geisha, discovering what it truly meant to dedicate your entire existence to the pursuit of artistic excellence and social grace. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're checking in from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. Are you settling in for the evening, or perhaps starting your day with some gentle history? Whatever brings you here, thank you for making our community a little larger and a little more connected. If you find yourself truly enjoying these quiet explorations through history's forgotten corners, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing and giving this video a like, but only if these stories genuinely resonate with you. Only if you find value in these slower, more contemplative journeys through time. Your support means everything to our growing community of history enthusiasts who appreciate the beauty in details others might find, well, boring. I'd also love to hear from you in the comments. What historical topic would you like us to explore next? Or simply check in and let us know you're here. Every comment, every interaction, reminds me that we're building something special together. A place where curiosity about the past can unfold at its own gentle pace. As we embark on tonight's journey, you might want to dim the lights, perhaps turn on a fan for some soothing background noise, and settle into a comfortable position. We have over 2 hours ahead of us, exploring not just the life of the geisha, but the entire floating world that surrounded them in Edo period Japan. Now, let's step through the wooden gates of a geisha house in 18th century Edo, where the sound of shamisen music drifts through paper walls, and where every day began long before dawn with rituals that would shape both body and spirit. What it really meant to be a geisha in Edo period Japan. The wooden clack of footsteps on polished floors would wake you before the first hint of dawn touched the shoshi screens. As a young Mako, an apprentice geisha, your day began at 4 in the morning, not with gentle stirring beneath warm covers, but with the sharp reality that your body was no longer entirely your own. Every aspect of your existence, from the angle at which you held your head to the precise placement of each toe as you walked, was subject to constant observation and correction. Your first sensation upon waking would be the dull ache in your neck, a reminder of the takamakura, the wooden block that had supported your elaborate hairstyle through the night. This wasn't simply discomfort, it was a necessary sacrifice. The complex shimada and other traditional hairstyles that marked your status could take hours to create and cost, more than most families earned in a month. A single night of careless sleep could destroy weeks of careful styling and result in severe punishment from your okosan, the house mother who governed every aspect of your training. The takamakura itself was a marvel of uncomfortable efficiency. Carved from hard wood and standing roughly 6 inches high, it forced you to sleep in an unnatural position. Your neck curved at an angle that kept your precious hairstyle from touching the futon. Many young girls never fully adapted to this strange pillow, spending years with chronic neck pain and headaches. Some would unconsciously roll off the block during sleep, only to wake to their okasan's fury and the prospect of spending the entire next day having their hair completely redone. A process that involved hours of painful pulling and the application of heavy oils and waxes that left the scalp tender and sore. But the takamakura was only the beginning of how your body would be reshaped for this life. The undergarments alone were a daily ordeal that most people could never imagine enduring. Your kimono, those gorgeous silk creations that tourists would later romanticize, were architectural marvels that required your body to conform to their structure rather than the other way around. The process of dressing took nearly 2 hours and required the assistance of at least 2 other people. First came the hadajuban, the innermost layer that touched your skin. Over this went the nagajuban, a longer underkimono that served as the foundation for everything else. But it was the koshimaki, the wrap worn around your waist, that truly began the transformation of your natural body shape. Tied so tightly that many girls initially fainted from the restriction. It compressed your waist and hips into the ideal cylindrical shape that the outer kimono demanded. Your breathing became shallow and deliberate, as deep breaths were simply impossible. The obi, the elaborate sash that wrapped around your waist, was perhaps the most brutal aspect of daily dress. These silk masterpieces could weigh up to 20 pounds and were wound around your torso with a force that left lasting indentations in your skin. The process of tying an obi properly required such strength that it was considered a specialized skill. Your dresser would place her knee against your back for leverage, pulling the silk tight enough to create the perfect silhouette while making comfortable sitting or bending nearly impossible. Walking in full geisha dress was an art form that took years to master, not because of grace or elegance, but because of the sheer physical challenge it presented. The kimono's narrow hem meant that your steps could be no longer than 6 inches. The heavy silk twisted around your legs with each movement, requiring a careful, shuffling gait that kept the fabric from binding completely. The zori, traditional sandals, elevated you several inches off the ground while providing almost no support for your feet. After hours of walking in these conditions, your feet would be raw with blisters, your legs cramped from the restricted movement, and your back aching from the constant effort of maintaining perfect posture despite the weight and restriction of your clothing. The tabby split-toe socks that seemed so elegant from a distance had their own particular discomfort, made from thick cotton and tied tightly around the ankle and calf. They provided little cushioning for feet that spent hours pressed into wooden sandals. The seam that ran along the sole created a ridge that pressed into your foot with each step, and the tight binding around your leg often restricted circulation enough to cause numbness and tingling. But perhaps most challenging of all was learning to navigate stairs in this elaborate costume. The combination of restricted leg movement, elevated shoes, and heavy, flowing fabric made even the simplest staircase a potential disaster. Many apprentice geisha bore scars from falls during their training, when a moment's inattention or a slightly too ambitious step sent them tumbling down wooden steps while wrapped in dozens of pounds of silk. The daily ritual of applying your makeup was equally demanding, though in different ways. The distinctive white face powder, called oshiroi, wasn't simply cosmetic, it was a mask that transformed you into something other than human. The process began with a base of oil, followed by layer after layer of white powder mixed with water to create a paste. This wasn't the gentle application of modern cosmetics, but rather a precise architectural project that could take over an hour to complete. The powder itself was made from ground rice and often contained lead, a fact that wasn't understood at the time, but which slowly poisoned many geisha over years of daily application. The sensation of wearing this mask was claustrophobic and uncomfortable. The thick paste created a rigid shell over your face that cracked if you smiled too broadly or made any expression too animated. You learned to control not just your emotions, but the very movement of your facial muscles, as any crack in the white surface would require immediate repair. The red lip paint, made from safflower petals and often applied in tiny, precise shapes that bore no resemblance to your actual lip line, required such skill that many geisha never fully mastered it. The pigment was applied with a small brush, creating shapes that varied depending on your age and status within the house. Younger Mako wore only a small spot of red on their lower lip, while fully qualified geisha could paint their entire mouth. But the paint itself was waxy and thick, making eating and drinking a careful choreography designed to preserve the perfect application. Your eyebrows were shaved off entirely and redrawn in a thin, high arch that bore no relationship to your natural features. This wasn't a daily process, but rather something done every few days with a sharp razor that often left cuts and irritation. The drawn-on eyebrows were created with a mixture of charcoal and oil, applied with tiny brushes to achieve the impossibly thin, precise lines that were considered beautiful. The daily schedule that governed your life as an apprentice was relentless in its demands. After the hours of dressing and makeup, your formal training began. This wasn't the romanticized version of learning elegant arts, but rather a grinding repetition of basic movements and techniques that had to be performed with absolute precision. Your shamisen lessons began with holding the instrument correctly, a skill that seemed simple but required months to master. The shamisen, a 3-stringed instrument played with a large plectrum called a bachi, demanded a specific posture that was maintained for hours at a time. Your back had to remain perfectly straight, your shoulders at a precise angle, your arms positioned exactly as tradition demanded. Any deviation from perfect form resulted in sharp correction from your teacher, often delivered with a wooden stick that left bruises on your arms and hands. The music itself was learned entirely by rote, with no written notation to guide you. Every song, every melody, every subtle variation had to be memorized through endless repetition. The shamisen strings were made from silk and required constant tuning, a process that had to be done by ear with perfect accuracy. A string that was even slightly out of tune would be immediately noticed by your teacher and result in severe criticism and additional practice hours. Dancing lessons were equally demanding, focusing not on natural movement or personal expression, but on the precise replication of forms that had been passed down unchanged for generations. Every gesture had meaning. Every turn of your wrist or angle of your head conveyed specific emotions or told part of a story. You spent hours each day practicing these movements until they became automatic, your body moving through the prescribed forms without conscious thought. The fan work alone required months of dedicated practice. The folding fan wasn't simply a prop, but rather an extension of your body that could express everything from seasonal changes to complex emotional states. Learning to open and close a fan with the proper timing, to hold it at the correct angles, to move it through space in ways that enhanced rather than distracted from your dance, required a level of precision that most people could never achieve. Your voice training was perhaps the most physically demanding aspect of your education. The traditional singing style required you to produce sounds from deep in your throat, creating the distinctive timbre that accompanied shamisen music. This wasn't natural singing, but rather a learned technique that often left your throat raw and aching, especially in the early months of training. You practiced scales and vocal exercises for hours each day, gradually developing the strength and control necessary to perform for hours without strain. The formal tea ceremony training added yet another layer of physical and mental discipline to your daily routine. Every movement in the tea ceremony was prescribed and meaningful. From the way you entered the tea room to the angle at which you held the tea bowl, you practiced the same sequence of movements hundreds of times, until your hands could perform the ceremony without conscious direction from your mind. But perhaps most challenging of all was learning the complex social protocols that governed every interaction within the geisha house and with the clients you would eventually serve. The hierarchy within the house was rigid and unforgiving. with subtle distinctions of rank that determined everything from where you could sit to who could speak to you directly. A bow that was too shallow or too deep, a word spoken out of turn, a failure to notice when a senior geisha needed assistance. All of these could result in punishment that ranged from extra work duties to physical correction. Your relationship with your courtesan was particularly complex and often difficult. She was responsible for your training, your behavior, and ultimately your success or failure as a geisha. This gave her absolute authority over your daily life, from what you ate to when you slept to how you spent every moment of your time. Many courtesan were former geisha themselves who understood the demands of the profession, but others were simply businesswomen who saw apprentices as investments that needed to show a profit. The financial realities of your training were never far from your mind. Every lesson, every piece of clothing, every meal you ate was carefully recorded as a debt that you would need to repay through your future earnings as a geisha. The costs were staggering, with a single formal kimono often costing more than a skilled craftsman could earn in several years. Your shamisen, your fans, your makeup, your lessons. All of these expenses accumulated into a debt that could take decades to repay. This economic pressure influenced every aspect of your training. You weren't simply learning to be an entertainer. You were being shaped into a product that needed to attract and please wealthy clients willing to pay premium prices for your company. Your success was measured not in artistic achievement or personal satisfaction, but in your ability to generate income for the house and eventually for yourself. The isolation from your family and former life was complete and often devastating. Most girls who entered geisha training did so as children, often sold by families who could no longer afford to feed them. Once you entered the house, contact with your former life was severed, sometimes permanently. You might learn years later that family members had died, married, or moved away. Information that reached you only if someone thought to mention it in passing. Your new identity as a geisha or as an apprentice working toward that goal became total. You were given a new name, often chosen by your kourtesan or by a senior geisha who served as your mentor. This wasn't simply a professional name, but rather a complete replacement of your former identity. You learned to answer to this new name, to think of yourself in these new terms, to gradually forget the child you had been before entering this world. The physical transformation that accompanied this change of identity was equally complete. The daily wearing of traditional dress, the constant attention to posture and movement, the restriction of natural expression, all of these gradually reshaped not just how you appeared to others, but how you experienced your own body. Many geisha later described feeling disconnected from their physical selves, as if they were living inside a beautiful costume that had gradually become their actual identity. Yet despite all of these challenges, despite the physical discomfort and emotional isolation, there was something undeniably compelling about the world you were entering. The geisha tradition represented one of the few paths available to women in Edo period Japan that could lead to financial independence, social influence, and artistic achievement. The suffering of your apprenticeship was balanced against the possibility of future success, status, and respect. Your fellow apprentices became your closest companions and sometimes your fiercest rivals. Friendships formed in this environment were often intensely loyal, forged through shared hardship and mutual support. But competition for the attention of teachers, for the favor of the kourtesan, for the eventual opportunity to debut as a full geisha, could also create bitter conflicts that lasted for years. The gradual accumulation of skills and knowledge, despite the difficult conditions under which you learned them, created a sense of accomplishment that few other pursuits could match. As your shamisen playing improved, as your dancing became more fluid, as your conversation grew more sophisticated, you began to understand why the geisha tradition had survived for centuries and continued to attract new students despite its demands. This was the daily reality of life as an apprentice geisha in Edo period Japan. Not the romanticized version often portrayed in popular culture, but rather a rigorous, demanding existence that required the sacrifice of personal comfort, family connections, and individual identity in pursuit of artistic mastery and social grace. It was a life that few could endure, but those who did discovered depths of beauty, tradition, and accomplishment that the outside world could barely imagine. Tomorrow we would wake again to the clack of wooden footsteps, again to the ache of the takamakura, again to hours of practice and correction and gradual improvement. But tonight, as the shamisen music drifted through the paper walls and the scent of incense filled the evening air, there was a moment of quiet satisfaction in knowing that each difficult day brought you one step closer to mastering one of the world's most demanding and beautiful traditions. Oiran Takao, the courtesan who defied convention. As the moon reached its zenith over Edo's sprawling neighborhoods in the year 1659, a young woman named Takao was transforming the very notion of what it meant to be desired in Japan's floating world. She wasn't born with a name that would become legendary, nor was she destined from birth for the life that would make her the most celebrated courtesan of her age. But in the pleasure quarters of Yoshiwara, where beauty was currency and tradition was law, Takao would rewrite the rules of power, attraction, and independence in ways that still echo through Japanese culture today. Born into circumstances that history has largely forgotten, the girl who would become Takao entered the world of the pleasure quarters as so many did, through necessity rather than choice. Her original name, lost to time like so many details of her early life, was replaced with one that meant tall tale, a reference perhaps to the elaborate hair ornaments that would become part of her signature style. But unlike the countless other young women who disappeared into the anonymous ranks of courtesans and entertainers, Takao possessed something that couldn't be taught, bought, or manufactured, an unshakable sense of her own worth. The Yoshiwara of Takao's time was a world unto itself, a carefully regulated district where the normal rules of Edo society were suspended but replaced with even more complex hierarchies and protocols. Here, in this floating world of temporary pleasures and permanent debts, Takao began her ascent from an unknown newcomer to the most sought-after courtesan of her generation. But her rise wasn't built on compliance or submission to the system that had created her. Instead, it was founded on her revolutionary idea that a woman, even one whose body was theoretically owned by others, could still maintain control over her heart, her mind, and ultimately her destiny. The training that shaped Takao into an Oiran, the highest rank of courtesan, was even more demanding than what apprentice geisha endured. Where geisha focused primarily on artistic accomplishment and social grace, Oiran were expected to embody the very essence of desirability and sophistication. This meant mastering not only music, dance, and poetry, but also the subtle arts of conversation, political awareness, and the kind of worldly knowledge that could make her an interesting companion to the most powerful men in Japan. Takao's education in these arts began before dawn each day and continued long into the evening. Her shamisen playing had to transcend mere hiksen, technical competence to achieve the kind of emotional resonance that could move listeners to tears or transport them to states of transcendent beauty. Her dancing wasn't simply choreographed movement, but rather a form of storytelling that could communicate complex emotions and narratives through gesture alone. Her poetry had to demonstrate not just literary skill, but also deep understanding of classical references, seasonal imagery, and the kind of sophisticated wordplay that marked true intellectual accomplishment. But it was in the realm of conversation that Takao truly began to distinguish herself from her contemporaries. While other courtesans learned to be agreeable, to flatter their clients and reflect back to them their own opinions and desires, Takao developed a reputation for intellectual independence that was both thrilling and dangerous. She read widely, not just the approved texts that formed part of standard courtesan education, but also political treatises, philosophical works, and contemporary literature that gave her insights into the broader world beyond Yoshiwara's gates. This intellectual curiosity led to conversations with her clients that were unlike anything they experienced elsewhere. Rather than simply agreeing with their views or providing the kind of unchallenging companionship that most men expected from courtesans, Takao engaged in genuine dialogue. She questioned their assumptions, challenged their reasoning, and offered perspectives that often surprised and delighted them. For men accustomed to deference from women, particularly from women in Takao's position, this intellectual equality was intoxicating. Her physical beauty, while certainly remarkable, was enhanced by an understanding of presentation that went far beyond conventional attractiveness. Takao studied the way light fell across her face, the angles that best displayed her profile, the colors and patterns that complemented her complexion and brought out the subtle variations in her expressions. She experimented with makeup techniques that enhanced her natural features while creating an otherworldly quality that set her apart from mortal women. But perhaps, most importantly, she mastered the art of selective availability. While other courtesans competed desperately for clients, accepting anyone who could afford their fees, Takao began to exercise choice in ways that were unprecedented for someone in her position. She developed preferences, not just for clients who were wealthy or powerful, but for those who could match her intellectually, who appreciated her for more than just physical beauty, who treated her as a person rather than a commodity. This selectivity was a dangerous game in a world where refusing clients could result in severe punishment or even expulsion from the quarter. But Takao played it with such skill that her rejections became part of her appeal. Men who might have taken any other courtesan for granted found themselves working to earn her favor, competing not just with money but with wit, charm, and genuine respect for her intelligence and autonomy. The stories of Takao's selective nature became legendary throughout Edo. There were tales of wealthy merchants who offered fortunes for her company only to be politely declined because they failed to appreciate her poetry. Politicians who found their advances rejected because they couldn't engage with her in meaningful conversation about literature or philosophy. Even samurai, accustomed to having their desires immediately gratified, discovered that Takao's attention had to be earned rather than commanded. One particular story that circulated widely involved a young daimyo, a feudal lord who was accustomed to having his way in all things. He had heard of Takao's reputation and decided that he must possess her, not out of any appreciation for her qualities, but simply because she was considered the most desirable woman in Edo. He arrived at her house with a retinue of servants, expensive gifts, and an assumption that his rank and wealth would be sufficient to secure her services. Takao received him with perfect courtesy, accepting his gifts graciously and engaging in polite conversation. But when he made it clear that he expected to proceed immediately to more intimate relations, she gently but firmly explained that she didn't yet feel they knew each other well enough for such intimacy. She suggested instead that they spend time in conversation, perhaps share some poetry, get to know each other as people rather than simply as client and courtesan. The young lord was first confused, then incredulous, and finally angry. He wasn't accustomed to having his desires delayed, or his expectations challenged. He offered more money, then threatened to use his political influence to have her punished for her refusal. But Takao remained serene and unmoved, explaining that intimacy, for her, required mutual respect and genuine connection. Things that couldn't be purchased or commanded. The confrontation ended with the daimyo storming out, swearing that he would never return and that he would ensure others knew of her impossible demands. But rather than damaging her reputation, his public complaints only enhanced her mystique. Other men began to see her not as a courtesan who was difficult to obtain, but as a woman who maintained her own standards even in circumstances that should have left her powerless. This incident, and others like it, established Takao as something entirely new in the world of Edo's pleasure quarters. A courtesan who wielded her own form of power. She transformed the traditional dynamic between client and entertainer, creating relationships that were based on mutual attraction and respect rather than simple economic transaction. This didn't mean she was naive about the commercial realities of her situation, but rather that she found ways to maintain her autonomy and dignity within a system that was designed to strip both away. Her influence on fashion and style extended far beyond the pleasure quarters. The way Takao arranged her hair, the colors she chose for her kimono, the particular way she tied her obi, all became trends that spread throughout Edo society. Women of all social classes began to imitate her style, creating a demand for the fabrics, accessories, and techniques that defined her look. Merchants who could claim to provide goods in Takao's style found their businesses thriving as everyone wanted to capture some small part of her magnetic appeal. But it was her influence on artistic expression that proved most enduring. The woodblock prints that depicted Takao weren't simply portraits of a beautiful woman, but rather studies in idealized femininity that established new standards for artistic representation of women. The poets who wrote about her created new forms of verse that captured not just her physical beauty, but also her intellectual vitality and emotional complexity. Her relationships with artists and writers were particularly significant because they were based on genuine mutual appreciation rather than simple patronage. Takao understood arts and literature well enough to offer meaningful criticism and encouragement to the creative men who sought her company. In return, they portrayed her not as a distant object of desire, but as a living, thinking woman whose complexity and depth deserved serious artistic attention. The paintings and prints that survive from this period show Takao in moments of contemplation, reading or writing poetry, engaged in conversation, or simply existing in states of thoughtful solitude. These images were revolutionary for their time because they presented a courtesan as a complete person rather than simply as a beautiful object. They suggested that her inner life was as rich and worthy of attention as her physical appearance. A radical idea in a society that rarely granted such complexity to women, particularly women in her profession. Her poetry, examples of which survive in various collections from the period, reveals a mind that was deeply engaged with the philosophical and spiritual questions of her time. She wrote about the transient nature of beauty and pleasure, the tension between duty and desire, the way seasonal changes reflected the cycles of human emotion. Her verses demonstrated not just technical skill, but also genuine insight into the human condition, earning respect from literary critics who might otherwise have dismissed the creative efforts of someone in her profession. But perhaps Takao's most radical act was her approach to love itself. In a world where courtesans were expected to simulate affection for anyone willing to pay for it, she insisted on the possibility of genuine emotion and authentic connection. She formed deep, lasting relationships with several clients. Relationships that transcended the usual boundaries between entertainer and customer to become something closer to true partnerships. These relationships weren't secret affairs conducted in shame, but rather open connections that she acknowledged and celebrated. She wrote poetry about her feelings for these men, made their preferences known to artists who wanted to please her, and in some cases even influenced their political and business decisions through her counsel and support. This wasn't the hidden influence that courtesans sometimes wielded through manipulation or seduction, but rather the open partnership of intellectual and emotional equals. The most famous of these relationships was with a wealthy merchant named Sorrowful, a man whose intelligence and sensitivity matched her own. Their connection became legendary throughout Edo, not as a scandalous affair, but as an example of what was possible when two exceptional people found each other despite the social barriers that should have kept them apart. They exchanged poetry, discussed philosophy, shared artistic interests, and created together a private world of mutual appreciation and support. Their relationship challenged conventional ideas about both romantic love and commercial sexuality. It suggested that genuine feeling could coexist with financial transaction, that a courtesan could maintain her professional obligations while also experiencing authentic emotion, that the boundaries between different types of human connection were more fluid than society generally acknowledged. The depth of Tako's connection with Sojiro was evident in the poetry they exchanged. Verses that circulated throughout Edo's literary circles and were copied, discussed, and analyzed by scholars and romantic enthusiasts alike. These weren't the formulaic expressions of affection that courtesans typically composed for clients, but rather deeply personal explorations of longing, connection, and the peculiar pain of loving someone you could only see under prescribed circumstances and commercial arrangements. One particularly famous exchange occurred during an autumn when Sojiro was required to travel to Osaka on business for several months. Tako sent him a poem comparing her waiting to the gradual change of maple leaves, each day bringing a new shade of loneliness as the season progressed without him. His response compared her to the moon, constant and beautiful even when clouds. Representing the demands of his business obligations, temporarily obscured his view of her. The sophistication of these verses, their genuine emotional resonance, combined with impeccable literary technique, elevated their relationship from mere romance to a kind of cultural event that others could witness and appreciate. But Takao's revolutionary approach to her profession extended beyond her personal relationships to encompass a broader vision of what courtesans could be and represent. She began to see herself not just as an entertainer who happened to possess exceptional skills, but as a kind of artist whose medium was life itself, whose creative work consisted of fashioning an existence that was both aesthetically perfect and emotionally authentic, despite the contradictions inherent in such a goal. This self-conception as artist, rather than simply as worker in the pleasure trade, influenced every aspect of how she conducted herself. She approached each client interaction as a kind of performance that required not just technical excellence, but also genuine emotional investment and creative interpretation. She viewed her wardrobe not as a collection of expensive work, uniforms, but as a carefully curated exhibition of textile art that communicated her aesthetic vision. Even her living quarters, which clients sometimes had the privilege of viewing, were arranged with the kind of attention to detail and symbolic meaning that one might find in a tea ceremony room. The influence Tako wielded over fashion extended to details that seemed minor but carried significant cultural weight. The particular shade of red she favored in her undergarments became known as Tako Red, and was eagerly sought by women throughout Edo who wanted to capture some essence of her style. The way she tied her obi with a slight asymmetry that somehow enhanced rather than diminished its elegance. spawned countless imitations and even detailed instructional texts explaining the technique. The floral motifs she preferred for her kimono, particularly combinations of chrysanthemums and flowing water, became so associated with her that other courtesans initially avoided them out of respect, before eventually adopting them as tributes. Her influence on hairstyle conventions was particularly significant, because it represented a democratization of beauty standards that had previously been rigidly controlled by tradition. Takao experimented with incorporating fresh flowers into her hair arrangements in ways that hadn't been done before, creating styles that were both more natural-looking and more elaborate than traditional approaches. She popularized the use of coral and jade ornaments at a time when gold and silver had been the only acceptable materials for high-ranking courtesans. These innovations weren't simply matters of personal preference, but rather represented a philosophy that beauty should be dynamic and evolving rather than static and prescribed. The economic impact of Takao's fashion influence was substantial enough to be documented in merchant records and correspondence from the period. Textile dealers who could claim to supply fabrics and patterns Takao had worn found their prices rising and their customer base expanding. Craftsmen who created the hair ornaments she favored discovered that demand for their work far exceeded their ability to produce. An entire secondary economy developed around attempting to replicate or approximate her style, creating employment and generating wealth for numerous artisans and merchants. But perhaps most remarkably, Takao's influence extended beyond the commercial sphere into the realm of social attitudes and values. Her insistence on being treated as a thinking, feeling individual rather than a beautiful object began to shift. However slightly, how at least some men in Edo society thought about courtesans and women more generally. The clients who learned to appreciate her intelligence and value her opinions found themselves unable to completely maintain their previous assumptions about female intellectual capacity or emotional depth. This educational influence operated through countless small interactions that accumulated into changed perspectives over time. A client who initially visited Takao solely for her legendary beauty might find himself engaged in a conversation about poetry that revealed depths of literary knowledge he hadn't expected. Another might discover that her observations about political situations were more insightful than those of his male colleagues. Yet another might realize through her example that women's apparent compliance with limiting social roles often masked far more complex inner lives and capabilities than he had previously imagined. The letters and diary entries that survive from some of Takao's clients revealed a profound impact these realizations could have on men, who had never before questioned the conventional wisdom about female nature and capabilities. Several wrote of feeling simultaneously enlightened and unsettled by their interactions with her, grateful for the expanded understanding she provided, while troubled by the implications this had for their relationships with wives, daughters, and other women in their lives. Takao's relationship with other courtesans was complex and sometimes fraught with the tensions that inevitably arose from her exceptional status. Some resented her success and influence, viewing her selective approach to clients as a form of arrogance that unfairly elevated her above colleagues who worked just as hard but lacked a particular combination of beauty, intelligence, and fearless self-assertion. Others admired her and sought to learn from her example, hoping to incorporate elements of her approach into their own professional practices. Her mentorship of younger courtesans became an important part of her legacy, though it was informal and selective rather than systematic. She didn't establish a school or training program, but rather took interest in particular young women who showed promise and shared her conviction that courtesans could be more than passive objects of male desire. She taught them not just artistic techniques, but also strategies for maintaining dignity and exercising choice within a profession that seemed designed to eliminate both. The advice Takao offered these protégés, fragments of which survive in various written accounts, reveals her sophisticated understanding of power dynamics and human psychology. She counseled them to develop genuine skills and knowledge that would give them value beyond physical beauty, which was inherently temporary. She encouraged them to cultivate selective availability, teaching them that scarcity could create desire more effectively than constant availability. She advised them to find clients who appreciated their minds as well as their bodies, arguing that such relationships were not only more satisfying but also more sustainable over the long term. But she also warned them about the dangers of her approach, the risks inherent in refusing to simply comply with client expectations and professional norms. She acknowledged that her method required not just skill and intelligence, but also exceptional beauty and fortunate timing, advantages that not every courtesan possessed. She cautioned that attempting to exercise too much independence too quickly could result in punishment or expulsion from the pleasure quarters, destroying rather than enhancing one's career. The political dimensions of Takao's influence, while subtle, were nonetheless real and potentially dangerous in the rigidly controlled society of Edo period Japan. By demonstrating that courtesans could exercise agency and command respect, she implicitly challenged the broader social hierarchies that placed women, and particularly women in her profession, at the bottom of the statist order. By proving that intelligence and character mattered as much as, or more, than beauty in creating lasting appeal, she undermined assumptions about female nature that justified women's subordination across all social classes. The authorities who governed Yoshiwara and regulated the pleasure trades were aware of Takao's influence and viewed it with mixed feelings. On one hand, her fame brought prestige and customers to the district, enhancing its reputation and economic vitality. On the other hand, her example of independence and selectivity, if widely imitated, could disrupt the careful systems of control that made the pleasure quarters profitable and manageable. There were periodic discussions among officials about whether Takao's behavior should be curtailed or regulated, but her economic value and the powerful clients who protected her generally prevented any serious intervention. This tension between Takao's revolutionary approach and the conservative forces that sought to maintain traditional arrangements created a constant underlying stress in her life. She had to navigate carefully between asserting her independence and avoiding such direct challenges to authority that she provoked retaliation. This required political sophistication and careful judgment, skills she developed over years of observing how power operated in Yoshiwara and in the broader society beyond its walls. But this openness about her feelings, this refusal to maintain the emotional distance that usually protected courtesans from becoming too attached to their clients, also made Takao vulnerable in ways that would ultimately contribute to her tragic end. The intensity of her emotional life, combined with the constant demands of her profession and the physical toll of maintaining her position at the top of Yoshiwara's hierarchy, created stresses that her body and spirit couldn't indefinitely sustain. The final years of Takao's life were marked by a gradual decline that those close to her attributed to various causes. Some said it was the weight of constantly maintaining perfection in every aspect of her appearance and behavior. Others believed it was the emotional exhaustion of managing relationships with multiple clients, while maintaining authentic feelings for the men she truly cared about. Still others suggested that her revolutionary approach to her profession had created enemies who worked subtly to undermine her health and reputation. Whatever the true cause, Takao's death at the young age of 27 sent shockwaves through Edo's society that extended far beyond the pleasure quarters. She had become more than just a famous courtesan. She had become a symbol of female independence, intellectual achievement, and the possibility that even within society's most restrictive systems, exceptional individuals could carve out spaces for dignity, choice, and authentic expression. The mourning that followed her death was unprecedented for someone in her position. Artists created memorial works that celebrated not just her beauty, but also her courage and intelligence. Poets wrote elegies that compared her to legendary figures from classical literature. Even political figures who had never met her publicly acknowledged the loss of someone who had enriched the cultural life of their city, simply by being herself so completely and courageously. Her legacy extended far beyond her own lifetime, influencing generations of women who saw in her example proof that circumstances need not determine destiny, that intelligence and strength could create possibilities even within the most limiting situations, that authenticity and dignity were worth pursuing even at great personal cost. In the years following her death, the stories of Takao's life were retold, embellished and mythologized until she became more legend than historical figure. But at their core, these stories preserved something essential about a remarkable woman who refused to be defined by others' expectations, who created her own form of power within a powerless position, and who demonstrated that even in the most unlikely circumstances, it was possible to live with integrity, intelligence, and grace. The mystery of the floating world, art, pleasure, and Buddhist philosophy. In the quiet hours before dawn in Edo period Japan, when the last clients had departed from the pleasure quarters and the courtesans had finally removed their elaborate makeup, there existed a moment of profound stillness that captured the essence of something the Japanese called ukiyo, the floating world. This wasn't simply a term for the entertainment districts or the ephemeral pleasures they offered, but rather a complex philosophical concept that would reshape an entire culture's understanding of beauty, mortality, and the nature of human experience itself. The mystery of ukiyo begins not in the pleasure quarters of Yoshiwara, but centuries earlier in Buddhist temples where monks contemplated the fundamental impermanence of all existence. The original meaning of ukiyo was sorrowful world, a reference to the Buddhist teaching that life is characterized by suffering, transience, and the endless cycle of desire that keeps souls trapped in rebirth. For early Buddhist thinkers, the floating world was something to be transcended, escaped through meditation, detachment, and the pursuit of enlightenment that would free one from the wheel of existence. But something remarkable happened during the Edo period, a transformation so subtle yet profound that it changed not only how people lived, but how they understood the very purpose of living. The same characters that had once meant sorrowful world began to be written differently, transformed through a slight alteration in one character to mean floating world, a realm not of suffering to be escaped, but of fleeting pleasures to be embraced. This wasn't merely a linguistic change, but rather a philosophical revolution that would influence everything from religious practice to artistic expression, to the daily choices that ordinary people made about how to spend their time and money. The transition from the sorrowful world to the floating world reflected a broader cultural shift that was taking place in Japanese society. The rigid social hierarchies of the feudal system, while still legally enforced, were being challenged by the growing wealth and cultural confidence of the merchant classes. These were people who had been traditionally considered the lowest of the social orders, below even farmers and craftsmen, yet who increasingly possessed the economic power to shape cultural trends and artistic movements. In this changing social landscape, the old Buddhist emphasis on detachment and the denial of worldly pleasures began to seem less relevant to people's actual experiences and desires. If life was indeed transient, if beauty and pleasure were destined to fade, then perhaps the appropriate response wasn't to deny these experiences, but rather to embrace them fully while they lasted. This philosophy didn't reject Buddhist insights about impermanence, but rather reinterpreted them as reasons for appreciation rather than avoidance. The floating world became a space where normal social rules were suspended, where a merchant could buy the company of the most refined entertainers, where artistic expression could flourish without the constraints of political censorship, where beauty could be pursued for its own sake rather than for moral edification. It was a world that acknowledged its own temporary nature, that celebrated rather than mourned the fleeting quality of human pleasure and connection. This philosophical shift found its most vivid expression in the art forms that emerged from and celebrated the floating world. Ukiyo, the woodblock prints that depicted scenes from the pleasure quarters, kabuki theater, and daily life in Edo represented a completely new approach to artistic subject matter. Previous Japanese art had focused primarily on religious themes, classical literature, or the natural world rendered in highly stylized, symbolic ways. Ukiyo instead celebrated the contemporary, the mundane, the pleasurable aspects of ordinary life. The artists who created these prints were documenting something unprecedented in Japanese culture, a world where pleasure was pursued openly and unapologetically, where beauty was created for the sake of beauty itself rather than for spiritual instruction or moral improvement. They captured not just what the floating world looked like, but what it felt like to inhabit a space where the usual rules and expectations had been temporarily suspended. The technical innovations that made ukiyo possible were themselves revolutionary. The woodblock printing process allowed for the mass production of images at prices that ordinary people could afford, democratizing art in ways that had never before been possible. A merchant or craftsman could now own pictures of beautiful courtesans, famous actors, or scenes from popular stories, bringing into their homes images of a world of sophistication and pleasure that might otherwise have remained completely beyond their reach. But the true innovation of ukiyo lay not in its technical processes, but in its philosophical approach to subject matter. These prints treated courtesans, actors, and other inhabitants of the floating world not as moral exemplars or cautionary figures, but simply as beautiful, interesting, complex human beings worthy of artistic attention. This represented a radical departure from traditional approaches to art that had always carried didactic or spiritual messages. The courtesan prints, known as bijinga, or pictures of beautiful women, were particularly revolutionary in their treatment of female subjects. Rather than depicting women as symbols of virtue or vice, mothers or temptresses, these images showed women as individuals with their own inner lives, their own moments of contemplation, pleasure, sadness, and joy. The best of these prints captured not just physical beauty, but also psychological complexity, suggesting depths of personality and emotion that invited viewers to see these women as complete human beings rather than simply as objects of desire. The mystery deepened when these images began to influence how people understood beauty itself. The ukiyo aesthetic, with its emphasis on line rather than volume, pattern rather than realistic detail, seasonal colors and motifs, and the capture of fleeting moments and expressions, began to shape not just how artists worked but how ordinary people saw the world around them. The floating world wasn't just a place you could visit in Yoshiwara. It was a way of perceiving beauty and pleasure that could transform any environment. This transformation of perception extended beyond visual art to influence literature, theater, and music. The popular novels of the period, known as ukiyo-zoshi, or tailies of the floating world, focused on contemporary life with an attention to realistic detail and psychological complexity that was unprecedented in Japanese fiction. These weren't heroic epics or moral instruction manuals, but rather explorations of how ordinary people navigated love, money, ambition, and disappointment in a rapidly changing society. The protagonists of these stories were often merchants, artisans, courtesans, and other members of the urban classes whose lives had previously been considered unworthy of literary attention. The authors treated their struggles and triumphs with the same seriousness that had previously been reserved for the adventures of nobles and samurai, suggesting that the experiences of common people were equally complex and meaningful. Kabuki theater, which emerged from the same cultural milieu as ukiyo and ukiyo-zoshi, brought the philosophy of the floating world to life in dramatically vivid ways. Unlike the highly stylized no theater that had been favored by the aristocracy, Kabuki was immediate, emotional, and accessible to popular audiences. It featured contemporary stories, realistic characters, and staging techniques that created a sense of intimacy between performers and audiences. The connection between Kabuki and the floating world went deeper than simple shared subject matter. The theater itself embodied the ukiyo philosophy of embracing transient pleasure and beauty. Each performance was unique and unrepeatable, existing fully only in the moment of its presentation and then dissolving back into memory. The actors, many of whom were also celebrated as fashion icons and objects of romantic fascination, embodied the floating world's fusion of artistic achievement with sensual appeal. But perhaps the most mysterious aspect of the floating world philosophy was how it managed to coexist with, rather than replace, traditional Buddhist and Confucian teachings. This wasn't a simple rejection of older values, but rather a complex synthesis that allowed people to maintain respect for traditional wisdom while also embracing new possibilities for experiencing pleasure and beauty. Many of the artists, writers, and entertainers who created the floating world were well-versed in classical literature, Buddhist philosophy, and Confucian ethics. They didn't see their celebration of transient pleasure as contradicting these traditions, but rather as extending and reinterpreting them for a new historical moment. The impermanence that Buddhism taught people to accept became a reason to appreciate beauty more intensely rather than to avoid it entirely. This synthesis created a unique cultural space where spiritual sophistication and sensual pleasure could coexist without conflict. A courtesan like Takao could write poetry that demonstrated deep understanding of Buddhist concepts while also celebrating the physical and emotional pleasures of her profession. An artist could create prints that captured the most ephemeral moments of beauty while also incorporating symbolic references to classical literature and philosophy. The floating world's influence extended far beyond Japan's borders, though this wouldn't become apparent until much later, when Japan was forced to open its ports to foreign trade in the mid-19th century. Ukiyo prints were among the first aspects of Japanese culture to capture Western imagination. European artists like Monet, Van Gogh, and Toulouse-Lautrec were profoundly influenced by the compositional techniques, color palettes, and subject matter of these prints. What particularly fascinated Western artists was the ukiyo approach to capturing everyday life and contemporary beauty without moral judgment or idealization. This provided a model for artistic movements like Impressionism that sought to break away from academic traditions and classical subject matter in favor of immediate, sensual responses to the modern world. The mystery of how Japanese artists had developed such a sophisticated aesthetic vocabulary for depicting pleasure, beauty, and transient experience would occupy Western art critics and collectors for decades. They recognized in ukiyo something that their own artistic traditions had largely lost: the ability to find profound meaning in simple, everyday experiences of beauty and human connection. But the floating world philosophy contained paradoxes that even its most sophisticated practitioners couldn't fully resolve. The emphasis on embracing transient pleasure often led to the very attachments and desires the Buddhist teaching identified as sources of suffering. The celebration of beauty and sensual experience could become its own form of obsession, no less binding than the worldly ambitions that traditional Buddhism encouraged people to abandon. These contradictions were perhaps most visible in the lives of the courtesans, Geisha, and other entertainers who embodied the floating world's ideals. Their pursuit of perfect beauty and refined pleasure often required tremendous sacrifice and discipline that seemed to contradict the philosophy's emphasis on spontaneous enjoyment. The floating world promised freedom from conventional restraints, yet it created its own elaborate systems of rules and expectations. The economic realities that supported the floating world also created moral complexities that its philosophy struggled to address. The pleasure quarters depended on systems of debt and indentured service that trapped many women in lives they wouldn't have chosen freely. The beautiful ukiyo prints that celebrated courtesans and geisha often obscured the harsh conditions of their daily existence, creating idealized images that bore little resemblance to the complex realities of their lives. Yet, despite these contradictions, or perhaps because of them, the floating world philosophy continued to evolve and adapt throughout the Edo period. Each generation found new ways to interpret the basic insight that beauty and pleasure, precisely because they are transient, deserve to be appreciated fully in the present moment. This wasn't simply hedonism or escapism, but rather a sophisticated attempt to find meaning and value in experiences that traditional philosophy had often dismissed as illusory or unimportant. The mystery of the floating world ultimately lies in its ability to transform a Buddhist teaching about the sorrowful nature of existence into a philosophy of aesthetic appreciation and sensual embrace. This transformation didn't require rejecting the original insight about impermanence, but rather reinterpreting it as an invitation to engage more fully with the beauty and pleasure that life offers. However, briefly, the role of music in expressing and transmitting ukiyo philosophy deserves particular attention, as sound provided a dimension of floating world experience that visual arts alone could not capture. The shamisen, with its distinctive, sharp, percussive tone quality, became the signature instrument of the floating world precisely because its sound was so different from the instruments favored in traditional chord music or Buddhist ritual. The shamisen's timbre was immediate, present, even slightly raw in ways that matched the floating world's emphasis on direct sensory experience rather than refined spiritual transcendence. The musical repertoire that developed around the shamisen reflected floating world values in both content and style. Many songs told stories of courtesans and their clients, of love affairs that were intense precisely because they were temporary, of the bittersweet recognition that pleasure and pain were inseparably intertwined. The melodies often featured sudden dynamic contrasts, unexpected rhythmic accents, and ornamental flourishes that created a sense of spontaneity and emotional immediacy rather than the carefully controlled restraint of classical music. The vocal techniques used in floating world music similarly emphasized emotional directness over polished refinement. Singers cultivated a slightly husky, intimate quality that suggested whispered confidences rather than formal performances. The lyrics often employed colloquial language and contemporary references that grounded the songs in the immediate reality of Edo life rather than in classical literary traditions. This accessibility was itself a philosophical statement, asserting that the experiences and emotions of ordinary urban dwellers deserved artistic expression just as much as the concerns of aristocrats and monks. The collaborative nature of musical performance in the floating world created social dynamics that reinforced ukiyo philosophy's emphasis on connection and shared experience. When a courtesan played shamisen to accompany her own singing while a client listened and perhaps joined in, the performance became a form of conversation, a way of establishing intimacy through coordinated aesthetic activity. The music created a shared emotional space that transcended the commercial nature of their relationship, at least temporarily, allowing for moments of genuine connection within a fundamentally transactional context. The development of Jiru narrative singing, which combined shamisen accompaniment with dramatic storytelling, expanded the expressive possibilities of floating world music. These performances could last for hours, telling complex stories with multiple characters and emotional shifts. The performer would modulate their voice to represent different characters, shift between narrative, description, and dramatic dialogue, coordinate their vocal dynamics with the shamisen's instrumental commentary. The result was a form of one-person theater that demonstrated how individual artistic skill could create rich, immersive, aesthetic experiences. The relationship between floating world music and kabuki theater was particularly symbiotic. Kabuki borrowed musical techniques and repertoire from the pleasure quarters while also influencing the kind of music performed there. Popular songs from kabuki productions would be adapted for shamisen performance in tea houses, while successful tea house musicians might be invited to perform in theaters. This circulation of musical material and techniques between different floating world venues created a sense of aesthetic coherence across the entire culture. The seasonal songs that marked different times of year in the floating world calendar demonstrated how music could encode the philosophy of transience at its core. Spring songs celebrated cherry blossoms with melodies that were beautiful but tinged with melancholy, acknowledging that the flowers would soon fall. Summer songs captured the feeling of sultry evening entertainments, with rhythms that suggested both languor and excitement. Autumn songs were often more contemplative, their melodies reflecting the season's association with harvest abundance, but also with approaching winter. Winter songs could be stark and spare, or warm and intimate, capturing both the harshness of the season and the pleasures of indoor gatherings. These seasonal variations weren't simply arbitrary changes of repertoire, but rather expressions of the floating world's deep engagement with cyclical time and natural rhythms. By aligning musical choices with seasonal changes, performers demonstrated their sensitivity to the larger patterns within which human pleasure-seeking took place. This connection to natural cycles grounded the artificial, urban world of entertainment districts in something larger and more enduring, creating a sense of meaning that transcended immediate gratification. The improvisational elements within floating world music reflected the philosophy's emphasis on spontaneity and present moment awareness. While performances followed established patterns and drew on familiar repertoire, skilled musicians were expected to introduce variations, ornamentations, and spontaneous responses to the particular mood and circumstances of each performance. This balance between structure and improvisation created music that felt both rooted in tradition and freshly created in the moment, perfectly embodying ukiyo philosophy's negotiation between accepting inherited forms and asserting individual creativity. The economic aspects of musical training and performance in the floating worlds reveal how artistic accomplishment was simultaneously valued for its own sake and commodified as entertainment. Learning to play shamisen and sing required years of dedicated study with teachers who charged significant fees. The instruments themselves represented substantial investments, with the finest shamisen costing as much as elaborate kimono. Yet this investment was considered essential for anyone seeking success as a high-ranking courtesan or geisha. demonstrating how artistic skill was understood as valuable capital that could generate returns through enhanced earning potential. The relationship between written texts and floating world philosophy added another dimension to how these ideas were disseminated and understood. While much of the floating world's culture was oral and performative, various forms of popular literature helped to articulate and reflect on the experiences and values associated with pleasure quarters. The guidebooks to Yoshiwara and other districts, while ostensibly practical reference works listing available courtesans and their specialties, often included literary flourishes and philosophical observations that elevated them beyond simple commercial directories. These guidebooks, known as seiken or courtesans' critiques, rated and described entertainers using a sophisticated vocabulary of aesthetic appreciation borrowed from traditional arts criticism. Courtesans were compared to flowers, to famous beauties from classical literature, to natural phenomena like the moon or autumn leaves. This literary treatment of commercial sex workers demonstrated the floating world's insistence that pleasure and beauty deserved the same serious aesthetic attention traditionally reserved for nature, religion, and classical arts. The shuriban, or books of wit, that depicted conversations between sophisticated clients and clever courtesans, served multiple functions within floating world culture. They provided entertainment through their witty dialogue and insights into human nature. They served as instruction manuals, teaching readers how to behave in pleasure quarter settings, what to say, how to demonstrate icky sophistication, and they articulated philosophical positions about pleasure, authenticity, and meaningful connection that helped give intellectual coherence to floating world values. The fictional dialogues in shuriban often revolved around questions of sincerity and performance, exploring how genuine feeling could emerge within relationships that were fundamentally theatrical and commercial. Characters would debate whether a courtesan's expressions of affection were real or professional performance, whether clients' declarations of love were sincere or simply part of the expected social ritual. These discussions weren't meant to resolve such questions definitively, but rather to explore their complexity and acknowledge the ambiguities inherent in floating world relationships. The ninjoban, or books of human feeling, took a different approach, presenting longer narratives that followed characters through complex emotional journeys involving love, duty, social obligation, and personal desire. These works often had tragic or bittersweet endings, acknowledging that the floating world's promise of pleasure and connection couldn't ultimately overcome the social and economic realities that constrain people's choices. Yet the narratives also affirmed the value of pursuing beauty and authentic feeling, even when circumstances made happy endings impossible. The kokiban, or comic books, used humor to explore floating world themes from yet another angle. These works poked fun at pretentious clients who took themselves too seriously, at courtesans who were skilled at manipulating gullible customers, at the elaborate social rituals that sometimes seemed ridiculous even to participants. The humor was usually affectionate rather than savage, laughing with rather than at floating world culture, acknowledging its absurdities while ultimately affirming its value. The integration of visual and textual elements in many floating world publications created reading experiences that engaged multiple senses and required different kinds of attention. Ukiyo prints might include calligraphic texts that were themselves artistic creations, their characters arranged in patterns that contributed to the overall composition. Books might feature illustrations that weren't simply decorations, but essential parts of the narrative. This multimedia approach reflected the floating world's general emphasis on creating rich, layered aesthetic experiences that engaged viewers and readers completely. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the floating world revealed its most profound truths. Practitioners of this philosophy found themselves inhabiting a space between acceptance and desire, between spiritual insight and worldly engagement, between the wisdom of detachment and the courage to embrace life's most intense experiences. It was a mystery that couldn't be solved through intellectual analysis alone, but only through the direct experience of beauty, pleasure, and human connection in all their transient glory. Life in the Yoshiwara pleasure quarter. The great gate of Yoshiwara stood like a threshold between worlds, its imposing wooden structure marking the boundary between the rigid social hierarchies of Edo and the strange, suspended reality of Japan's most famous pleasure quarter. Beyond these gates lay a city within a city, a carefully constructed realm where the normal rules of Japanese society were replaced by an entirely different set of customs, expectations, and possibilities. To pass through this entrance was to enter not merely a different neighborhood, but a different understanding of what human life could contain. The physical layout of Yoshiwara was itself a marvel of urban planning, designed to create an experience that was both intoxicating and contained. The quarter was surrounded by a moat and high walls, not merely for security, but to create the sense of entering a separate realm entirely removed from the ordinary world. The single bridge that crossed the moat and the single gate that provided entry were deliberate bottlenecks that forced visitors to make a conscious transition from their everyday lives into this floating world of pleasure and artifice. Inside the walls, the streets were laid out in a precise grid that maximized both beauty and commercial efficiency. The main thoroughfare, known as Nakanoko, was wide enough to accommodate the elaborate processions that marked special occasions, lined with tea houses, restaurants, and shops that catered to every conceivable desire. The side streets were narrower, more intimate, creating spaces where private negotiations and personal connections could flourish away from the public spectacle of the main avenue. The architecture itself was designed to blur the boundaries between interior and exterior space, between public performance and private intimacy. The buildings featured extensive use of sliding screens and removable partitions that could transform spaces instantly depending on the needs of the moment. A room that served as a reception area during the day could become a performance space in the evening and a private chamber later in the night, all through the simple manipulation of wooden frames and paper screens. The visual impact of Yoshiwara, particularly at night, was carefully calculated to overwhelm the senses and create a state of aesthetic intoxication that would make visitors forget their everyday concerns. Hundreds of lanterns illuminated the streets in colors that ranged from warm amber to deep red, creating pools of light and shadow that transformed even the most mundane activities into scenes of dramatic beauty. The interplay of light and darkness, the way shadows fell across silk kimono and painted faces, the flicker of flame against polished wood, all contributed to an atmosphere that seemed to exist outside normal time and space. The sounds of Yoshiwara were as carefully orchestrated as its visual elements. The shamisen music that drifted from countless windows created a complex auditory landscape that varied throughout the day and night. During the afternoon, the music was gentler, more contemplative, designed to create an atmosphere of refined calm that would appeal to clients seeking conversation and companionship. As evening approached, the tempo increased. The melodies became more complex and emotionally charged, building toward the nighttime hours when passion and intensity were expected to reach their peak. The rhythmic clacking of wooden getters' sandals on the stone-paved streets provided a constant percussion that underlay all other sounds. This wasn't accidental background noise, but rather an integral part of the quarter's carefully constructed atmosphere. The different sounds made by different types of footwear, the varying rhythms of people walking for different purposes, the way sound carried and echoed off the wooden buildings, all created an auditory signature that was uniquely characteristic of this place. But perhaps most distinctive were the human voices that filled Yoshiwara's air throughout the day and night. The calls of street vendors selling everything from tea to cosmetics to small luxury items created a commercial symphony that never entirely ceased. The laughter of clients and entertainers, the murmur of conversations conducted in doorways and tea houses, the occasional raised voice of someone negotiating a price or settling a dispute, all blended into a complex human soundscape that testified to the incredible density of social interaction that characterized life in the quarter. The economic engine that powered this elaborate spectacle was far more complex than simple prostitution. Though sexual services were certainly part of what Yoshiwara offered, the quarter functioned as a complete entertainment ecosystem where visitors could spend days without ever needing to return to the outside world. There were restaurants that served elaborate multi-course meals designed to complement the aesthetic experience of the quarter. Tea houses offered spaces for conversation, games, and the kind of refined socializing that was the hallmark of upper-class culture. Theaters presented performances that ranged from classical drama to contemporary satire, often featuring actors who were themselves celebrities whose personal lives were followed as avidly as their professional careers. The courtesans and geisha, who were the quarter's primary attractions, operated within a complex hierarchy that determined not only their income but also their social status, their freedom of movement, and their prospects for the future. At the top of this hierarchy were the Oiran Takao, women who commanded enormous fees and exercised considerable choice over their clients. These women were essentially independent business operators who used the infrastructure of the pleasure quarter to market their services while maintaining significant control over their own lives and careers. Below the Oiran were various ranks of courtesans and entertainers, each with their own protocols, expectations, and economic arrangements. The Taiyu were accomplished artists who provided sophisticated entertainment but might not offer sexual services. The Kushi were less expensive courtesans who catered to middle-class clients seeking companionship and pleasure without the elaborate protocols required by high-ranking women. At the bottom of the hierarchy were women who worked primarily as prostitutes, offering sexual services with minimal pretense of artistic or intellectual accomplishment. But even this hierarchical structure doesn't capture the full complexity of social relations within Yoshiwara. There are also the chawu owners who managed the establishments where courtesans worked, the servants and assistants who maintained the elaborate infrastructure required to support the entertainment industry, the musicians and artists who provided cultural programming, the security forces who maintained order, and the countless other workers who made the quarter function as a complete social system. The daily rhythms of life in Yoshiwara were unlike those in any other part of Edo. The quarter began to come alive in the late afternoon as visitors started arriving for evening entertainment. The early hours were devoted to preparation, as courtesans underwent the elaborate process of dressing and makeup that transformed them into living works of art. This wasn't simply personal grooming, but rather a collective ritual that involved entire teams of assistants working to create the visual spectacle that clients expected. The process of applying traditional makeup alone could take several hours and required specialized knowledge that was passed down through generations of practitioners. The white face powder had to be mixed to exactly the right consistency, applied in precise patterns that varied according to the season, the occasion, and the individual woman's status within the hierarchy. The red lip paint was applied with tiny brushes in shapes that carried specific cultural meanings. The elaborate hairstyles required not only artistic skill but also engineering expertise, as they had to be constructed to withstand hours of wear while supporting heavy, ornamental accessories. The clothing worn by courtesans represented some of the finest textile work produced in Japan during this period. These weren't simply garments, but rather wearable sculptures that required teams of specialists to create and maintain. The silk fabrics were often hand-painted or decorated with embroidery that took months to complete. The obi sashes could weigh 20 pounds or more and were tied in complex knots that served both aesthetic and practical purposes. The layers of underkimono had to be arranged so that their edges showed in precisely calculated patterns that communicated information about the wearer's status, the season, and the nature of the occasion. As evening progressed, the court had transformed into a stage for elaborate social rituals that had been refined over generations. The famous Oiran processions, where high-ranking courtesans paraded through the streets, accompanied by retinues of assistants and admirers, were carefully choreographed performances that could take hours to complete. Every aspect of these processions, from the route taken to the pace of walking to the interactions with spectators, followed established protocols that had been developed to maximize both visual impact and commercial appeal. The tea houses, where much of Yoshiwara's social life took place, were designed to facilitate a complex form of entertainment that combined elements of restaurant dining, theatrical performance, intellectual salon, and dating service. Clients didn't simply arrive and immediately engage the services of particular courtesans, but rather participated in elaborate social rituals that could extend over multiple visits and involve entire networks of entertainers, assistants, and intermediaries. A typical evening at a high-end tea house might begin with a carefully planned meal featuring seasonal ingredients prepared according to aesthetic principles that made each dish a small work of art. The presentation of food was coordinated with the room's decorative elements, the participants' clothing, and even the weather outside to create a unified aesthetic experience. Conversation during the meal followed established patterns that allowed participants to demonstrate their cultural sophistication while gradually building toward more intimate interactions. After the meal, there might be musical performances where courtesans demonstrated their mastery of traditional instruments and songs. These weren't casual entertainments, but rather serious artistic presentations that required years of training to execute properly. Clients were expected to appreciate not only the technical skill involved, but also the subtle cultural references embedded in the choice of pieces and their manner of presentation. Poetry composition and appreciation formed another layer of evening entertainment that required considerable education and cultural sophistication from both performers and audience. The ability to compose appropriate verses in response to seasonal themes, to reference classical literature in subtle and clever ways, to participate in collaborative poetry creation, all marked participants as members of an educated elite who possessed the cultural capital necessary to fully appreciate what Yoshiwara offered. Games of various kinds provided opportunities for more casual interaction while still maintaining the court's emphasis on refinement and cultural accomplishment. These ranged from complex board games that required strategic thinking to word games that demonstrated literary knowledge to gambling. Activities that added an element of excitement and risk to the evening's entertainment. But underneath all of this elaborate cultural programming lay the quarter's fundamental economic reality. It was a business designed to extract as much money as possible from its clients while providing them with experiences that justified the enormous costs involved. The pricing structures were complex and often deliberately opaque, designed to encourage visitors to spend more than they had originally planned, while making it difficult to calculate the true costs of various services. A single evening's entertainment at a high-end tea house could easily cost more than most people earned in several months. This wasn't simply the result of greed on the part of the establishments, but rather reflected the genuine costs involved in maintaining the court's elaborate infrastructure. The courtesan's clothing, makeup, and accessories represented significant investments that had to be recouped through client fees. The buildings required constant maintenance to preserve their beauty and functionality. The small army of workers who kept the quarter operating had to be paid wages that would keep them available for the irregular schedules that entertainment work required. The seasonal variations in Yoshiwara's activities added another layer of complexity to both its cultural programming and its economic operations. Different times of year called for different types of entertainment, different aesthetic themes, different social rituals. The spring cherry blossom season brought floods of visitors seeking to combine appreciation of natural beauty with human companionship. Summer festivals required elaborate preparations and special programming that could take months to plan and execute. Autumn brought a more contemplative mood that emphasized poetry, music, and the kind of philosophical conversation that appealed to intellectually sophisticated clients. Winter presented particular challenges, as the quarter had to maintain its atmosphere of luxury and pleasure, despite the harsh weather that made travel difficult and expensive. This was when the most exclusive and expensive entertainments took place, as only the most dedicated and wealthy clients were willing to brave the cold for evening adventures in Yoshiwara. The relationship between Yoshiwara and the broader society of Edo was complex and sometimes contradictory. Officially, the quarter was tolerated by the government as a necessary evil that provided controlled outlets for desires that might otherwise disrupt social order. The concentration of commercial sexuality within clearly defined boundaries made it easier for authorities to monitor and regulate these activities, while preventing them from spreading throughout the city. But unofficially, Yoshiwara served functions that went far beyond simple sexual commerce. It was a space where new forms of art and entertainment could be developed and tested before being adopted by mainstream society. Fashion trends that originated in the quarter often spread throughout Edo and beyond, influencing how people of all social classes thought about beauty, style, and personal presentation. The quarter also served as a space where social boundaries could be temporarily suspended in ways that were impossible elsewhere in Edo's rigid class society. A wealthy merchant who was officially considered inferior to even the poorest samurai could, within Yoshiwara's walls, command the attention and respect of the most accomplished entertainers in Japan. This wasn't true social equality, but it was a form of status inversion that provided psychological satisfaction for people whose talents and achievements were undervalued by the official social hierarchy. For many visitors, Yoshiwara represented an escape not just from daily responsibilities, but from the constraints of identity itself. Within the quarter's carefully constructed fantasy environment, people could experiment with different versions of themselves, explore desires and interests that their regular lives didn't accommodate, engage in conversations and activities that their usual social circles wouldn't permit. But this freedom came at significant costs that extended beyond the financial expenses involved. The intensity of experience that Yoshiwara offered could become addictive in ways that disrupted visitors. The ability to find satisfaction in their ordinary lives. Many men found themselves caught in cycles of debt and obsession that destroyed their relationships with family and friends, their business prospects, and their physical and mental health. The women who worked in Yoshiwara faced even more complex challenges as they navigated between the quarter's promise of glamour and independence and the harsh realities of economic dependence and social stigma. Even the most successful courtesans found their choices limited by the expectations of their profession, and the economic structures that governed their lives. As the night deepened in Yoshiwara and the last clients made their way home through darkened streets, the quarters settled into a different rhythm. The public performances ended, the elaborate social rituals concluded, and what remained was a community of people who had chosen or been chosen by circumstances to make their lives in this strange space between reality and fantasy. The infrastructure required to maintain Yoshiwara's operations was vast and largely invisible to visitors who experienced only its polished surface. Behind every successful tea house stood networks of suppliers, craftspeople, and service workers whose labor made the elaborate performances possible. The kimono required constant maintenance and repair by skilled seamstresses who could work with delicate silk without damaging it. The hairstyles demanded specialists who could create and repair the complex structures that courtesans wore. The buildings needed carpenters, plasterers, and painters to maintain their appearance of elegant perfection. The food that sustained both workers and clients required its own elaborate supply chains. Fresh fish had to be delivered daily from Edo's markets, arriving early enough to be prepared for evening meals, but fresh enough to meet the high standards expected in establishments that charged premium prices. Seasonal vegetables and specialty ingredients were sourced from farms and suppliers throughout the region. Sake of various qualities and price points had to be stocked to match different clienteles and occasions. The logistics of provisioning dozens of establishments, each serving multiple meals daily, required coordination and efficiency that rivaled any commercial operation in Edo. The textile economy the Yoshiwara generated was particularly significant, creating demand that supported weavers, dyers, embroiderers, and fabric merchants throughout Japan. A single higher-ranking courtesan might own dozens of formal kimono, each representing months of specialized labor. The fabrics themselves came from silk producers in rural areas, the dyes from plant cultivators and mineral processors, the gold and silver threads used in the most elaborate examples from metal workers using techniques that had been refined over centuries. This textile production represented one of Edo period Japan's most sophisticated manufacturing sectors, and Yoshiwara was among its most important customers. The cosmetics industry similarly depended heavily on the pleasure quarter's constant demand for makeup and beauty products. The white face powder required rice cultivation and processing specifically for cosmetic use. The red pigments came from safflower petals that had to be harvested and processed using techniques that preserved their color intensity. The oils, waxes, and perfumes used in daily grooming routines came from suppliers throughout Japan, and sometimes from international trade networks that brought exotic ingredients from China and Southeast Asia. The relationship between Yoshiwara and Edo's broader economy was complex and sometimes controversial. Critics argued that the enormous sums spent in the pleasure quarters represented waste that could have been invested more productively in business ventures or agricultural improvements. Defenders countered that this spending generated employment and economic activity that benefited large numbers of people, from the obvious workers in the entertainment industry to the less visible suppliers and craftspeople whose livelihoods depended on the quarter's prosperity. The social mobility, limited though it was, that Yoshiwara offered to some women provided arguments both for and against the system. A small number of courtesans did achieve wealth and independence through their work, accumulating enough capital to eventually leave the profession, pay off their debts, and establish themselves as tea house owners or in other respectable occupations. These success stories were celebrated as proof that merit and talent could overcome the circumstances of birth, that even women from the poorest backgrounds could rise to positions of relative comfort and security. But these exceptional cases obscured the reality that most women in the pleasure quarters never achieved such success. The majority worked in lower ranks of the hierarchy, earning modest incomes that barely covered their living expenses and never fully paid off the debts they had accumulated. Many suffered health problems from the physical demands of their work, from diseases that spread easily in crowded conditions, from the effects of lead-based cosmetics and other beauty products whose dangers weren't understood. The average career span was relatively short, with many women aging out of the profession by their late 20s or early 30s, with few prospects for alternative employment. The children born to women working in Yoshiwara faced particular challenges that highlighted the contradictions in the system. Sons of courtesans had ambiguous social status, neither fully part of the respectable merchant class nor entirely confined to the pleasure quarters. Some were educated and eventually established themselves in legitimate businesses, though they often faced discrimination based on their origins. Daughters faced the likelihood of following their mothers into the profession, as few other opportunities were available to them, and the skills required for success in the pleasure quarters were most easily acquired through early exposure. The medical realities of life in Yoshiwara were harsh, despite the quarter's veneer of luxury and refinement. Sexually transmitted diseases were common and largely untreatable with Edo period medical knowledge. Pregnancies, whether carried to term or terminated, posed serious health risks in an era before modern obstetric care. The physical toll of wearing restrictive clothing for hours daily, of maintaining unnatural postures, of sleeping in positions designed to preserve hairstyles rather than provide restful sleep, accumulated into chronic pain and disability for many women. The mental and emotional health challenges were equally significant, though less visible. The constant need to perform pleasure and desire regardless of one's actual feelings. The management of relationships with multiple clients who might be demanding or abusive. The lack of control over one's own schedule and activities, all created stresses that manifested in various ways. Some women turned to alcohol or other substances to cope with the demands of their profession. Others developed what we might now recognize as depression or anxiety disorders, though these conditions weren't understood or treated effectively in their time. The regulatory framework that governed Yoshiwara was designed primarily to serve the interests of the shogunate and the proprietors of establishments rather than to protect the women who worked there. Rules specified what courtesans could wear, where they could go, whom they could see, always with an eye toward maintaining order and maximizing profits rather than ensuring fair treatment or humane conditions. The authorities who oversaw the quarter were more concerned with preventing escapes and maintaining the tax revenue that Yoshiwara generated than with addressing exploitation or abuse. Yet within these constraints, women found ways to exercise agency and build meaningful lives. Friendships among courtesans provided emotional support and practical assistance that helped individuals survive and occasionally thrive despite difficult circumstances. Mentorship, relationships between senior and junior women transmitted not just professional skills, but also survival strategies and emotional resilience. Some women formed romantic partnerships with each other that provided intimacy and connection without the performance demands of client relationships. The rituals and traditions that courtesans maintained among themselves created a sense of community and shared identity that partially compensated for their isolation from mainstream society. Celebrations of successful debuts, ceremonies marking retirements, gatherings to remember colleagues who had died, all reinforced bonds among women who shared similar experiences and challenges. These internal social structures created meaning and connection that existed independently of the commercial entertainment that was their ostensible purpose. The artistic and cultural contributions that emerged from Yoshiwara were real and significant, despite the exploitation and suffering that also characterized life there. the music, dance, poetry, and visual arts that the pleasure quarters generated enriched Japanese culture in ways that extended far beyond entertainment. The fashion and aesthetic innovations that originated in Yoshiwara influenced how people throughout Japan thought about beauty and style. The philosophical insights about pleasure, transience, and authentic connection that floating world culture articulated continue to resonate centuries later. This complexity, the coexistence of genuine cultural achievement with systematic exploitation, of moments of beauty and connection with structures of control and commodification, prevents any simple moral judgment about Yoshiwara and what it represented. We can acknowledge the artistry and philosophical sophistication while also recognizing the human cost at which they were achieved. We can appreciate the limited agency and dignity that some women managed to maintain while also understanding the severe constraints and injustices they faced. The legacy of Yoshiwara and similar pleasure quarters throughout Japan remains contested in contemporary discussions about history, gender, and cultural heritage. Some emphasize the artistic and cultural contributions, arguing that the geisha and courtesan traditions represent important aspects of Japanese aesthetic history that deserve preservation and appreciation. Others focus on the exploitation and limited choices that characterized most women's experiences in these systems, cautioning against romanticizing what were fundamentally oppressive institutions. The morning would bring its own rhythms, its own challenges and opportunities. The careful work of maintaining the illusion would begin again with the first application of makeup, the first arrangement of silk kimono, the first tuning of chamois and strings. The floating world would continue its endless dance between pleasure and sorrow, beauty and artifice, freedom and constraint. And we, looking back across the centuries at this remarkable social experiment, can appreciate both its achievements and its contradictions. Its capacity to create beauty and its potential to cause harm, its insights into human nature and its limitations as a guide for living. The mystery of Yoshiwara, like the mystery of the floating world itself, lies not in any single truth it reveals, but in the complexity of truths it contains, the way it illuminates both the heights and depths of human possibility. As our journey through Edo period Japan comes to a close, we've traveled from the private struggles of apprentice geisha, learning to sleep on wooden blocks, through the revolutionary independence of the courtesan Takao, into the philosophical depths of the floating world concept, and finally through the elaborate social theater of Yoshiwara itself. These aren't simply stories from a distant past, but rather windows into the eternal human struggles to find meaning, beauty, and connection within the constraints that society and circumstance impose upon us. The geisha who mastered dozens of traditional arts while sacrificing personal comfort. The courtesan who insisted on choosing her own clients despite economic pressure. The artists who found new ways to celebrate transient beauty. The ordinary people who sought escape and transformation in the pleasure quarters, all remind us that human creativity and resilience can flourish even in the most restrictive circumstances. Perhaps what's most remarkable about the world we've explored tonight is how it managed to create space for genuine artistry, authentic emotion, and meaningful human connection within systems that might have seemed designed to prevent exactly these possibilities. The geisha tradition, despite its demands and restrictions, produced some of Japan's most accomplished artists and cultural innovators. The floating world philosophy, despite its contradictions, offered insights into beauty and impermanence that continue to influence how we understand aesthetic experience. Even Yoshiwara, despite its economic exploitation and social limitations, created a space where new forms of entertainment, fashion, and social interaction could develop and flourish. These historical examples remind us that human dignity and creativity are remarkably resilient, capable of finding expression even in circumstances that seem designed to suppress them. They also remind us that every social system, no matter how restrictive it appears from the outside, contains possibilities for agency, choice, an authentic expression that can't be entirely eliminated. As you settle into sleep tonight, perhaps you'll carry with you some appreciation for the complex beauty that emerged from this long-vanished world. Some recognition of the courage it took for individuals like Takao to insist on their own worth within limiting circumstances. Some understanding of how ordinary people in all times and places find ways to create meaning and beauty in their lives, despite the constraints they face. Thank you for joining me on this extended journey through one of history's most fascinating cultural experiments. Your presence here, your willingness to spend these hours exploring the details of lives lived centuries ago, continues to build our community of people who find value in understanding how others have navigated the eternal challenges of being human. I'd love to hear in the comments what aspects of tonight's exploration resonated most with you, what questions it raised, or what other historical topics you'd like us to investigate together. Every comment helps shape our future journeys and reminds me of the privilege of sharing these stories with people who appreciate their complexity and beauty. Until our next exploration together, may you find your own ways to create beauty and meaning within whatever circumstances you face. And may you rest well knowing that you're connected to the long tradition of people who have sought to understand and appreciate the rich complexity of human experience. Sweet dreams, and thank you for being such an important part of our growing community of gentle history explorers.